So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature. We're looking at Joseph Heller's novel Catch-22. So in this session today, we will look at a certain section from chapter 27. And again, the chapter is called Nurse Duckett. And it starts with a very vulgar scene about Worcestering sexually attacking the nurse. But then again, the way it is represented, we're not quite sure whether we are supposed to sympathize with a nurse or sympathize with Worcestering. And again, we are looking at a very complex cognitive frame where the difference between sympathy and resentment is very, very blurred, if there's any difference at all. And that seems to be the entire culture of representation of the novel, which seems to be quite absurdist at certain points of time, where we're not quite sure whether to take it seriously or to take it in a tragicomic way. And tragicomedy is a dominant sentiment in this novel, as is the case with several pieces of absurd theatre. Now, on your screen at the moment, there is a section where there's an exchange going on between Worcestering and the colonel, and the Worcestering's friend Dunbar also happens to be there, and Worcestering is being interrogated for sexually attacking Nurse Duckett, and obviously he's going to be show-cast, and there will be some punitive measures against him. But then again, he's trying to feign his way out. He's trying to feign the madman's role. So he's trying to pretend to be madman and then in the process medicalize his situation and get away with it. So in a very strange way, there seems to be some kind of an Hamletian quality about Worcestering. Because if you remember Hamlet, Shakespeare's original play, there too Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, he pretends to be mad at several points of time. And that seems to so justify some of the very cruel things he does, especially to women. So there's a lot of misogyny in Hamlet, a lot of sexism, a lot of violence, almost vitriolic verbal violence against women. And of course that gets extended into physical violence, and Ophelia gets killed. But then, every time we're supposed to resent Hamlet's actions, he almost instantly medicalizes himself. He pretends to be a madman. So that provides some kind of a pseudo quasi justification for his action. And there seems to be a similar attempt here on the part of Worcestering as well, where he's, he just, every time he's accountable, he's held accountable for his actions, he medicalizes himself. And of course, we talked about how the medicalizing of madness over here is a very common trope among soldiers who want to survive the war. And because they're doing it deliberately, because they're performing madness in a certain sense, it has a comic effect on certain occasions, right? And this is Second World War, mind you. This is way before soldiers' trauma was medicalized in a proper way. This is not way before the word PTSD came into being. So there is all that. So these are people who are malingering and pretending to be mad, and in the process trying to get away from the shock of the war. But then again, they have suffered the war enough for them to behave irrationally, for them to behave in a way which doesn't know the difference between tragedy and comedy, between attack and defense, right? So here is a conversation that is going on between the colonel and Worcestering, where he's been questioned about why he sexually attacked Nurse Duckett. And the doctor addresses Dunbar and Worcestering together and says, "Are you both crazy?" The doctor cried shrilly, backing away in paling confusion. So the doctor seems to be confused. The doctor seems to be going pale, and that again is a commentary on the complexity of the condition. The doctors have no idea of what is going on, and they seem to be requiring some medical help. So doctors are confused. So, "Are you both crazy?" The doctor cried shrilly, backing away in paling confusion. "Yes, he really is crazy, Doc," Dunbar assured him. "Every night he dreams he's holding a live fish in his hands." The doctor stopped in his tracks with a look of elegant amazement and distaste, and a word grew still. "He does what?" he demanded. So again, if you take a look at the choice of adjectives, elegant amazement, you don't normally expect this combination. Elegant distaste, you don't, again, normally expect this combination, but it's the very complex semantic politics over here, in a way the words are produced and juxtaposed together in a way which doesn't make sense all the time. And that production of irrationality seems to be a very key representative category in this novel, the constant production and consumption of irrationality. and irrationality, of course, as a narrative strategy as well. I mean, the whole process of narrativizing it requires irrationality, or the instrument of irrationality. So elegant amazement and distaste. And the word grew very still, and the doctor wants to reconfirm that. He does what? He demanded. He dreams he's holding a live fish in his hand. What kind of fish? The doctor inquired sternly of Vercerin. I don't know, Vercerin answered. I can't tell one kind of fish from another. In which hand do you hold them? It varies, answers Vercerin. It varies with the fish, Dunbar added helpfully. So, as you can see again, they're trying to medicalize themselves in a way which is also quite comic, pseudo-comic, because, there is this very serious allegation of sexual assault against Vercerin, and he's probably going to be short-cast and suspended from service, and more seriously, he might be suspended from the hospital. But he wants to stay in the hospital because he gets free food, he's taken care of, and he doesn't obviously want to go back to the front line. So now he's malingering and he's performing madness, he's medicalizing himself, and obviously there's some kind of a duet happening within Dunbar and Vercerin, and they're helping each other. And Dunbar creates or fabulates this narrative about Vercerin dreaming of holding a fish. And just to make it more complicated and confused, he keeps adding different details which, again, make no sense. But the whole purpose of it is to produce irrationality. It produces narrative of irrationality, this perception of irrationality, which is embodied by Vercerin. The colonel turned and stared down at Dunbar suspiciously with a narrow squint. Yes, and how come you seem to know so much about it? So that's the obvious question, isn't it? How come you seem to know so much about Vercerin and what he dreams of, and what kind of fish he dreams of, and what hand he holds, which hand he uses to hold the fish, etc. How does Dunbar know so much? I'm in the dream, Dunbar answered without crackling a smile. So I'm part of the dream as well. So this just gets very, very cognitively complicated, almost funny. And the whole point over here is to muddle the doctor's imagination, to make him confused in a way that he gives up and, just recommends more rest for Vercerin, recommends more medicine for Vercerin, and in the process recommends him to stay in the hospital because he doesn't have a clue about what is wrong with him. Because if you remember the opening line of this the opening section of the novel, where the doctors don't know if he has jaundice in his liver, but they also don't know if he doesn't have jaundice in his liver. So that is a catch-22 situation, the medical ambivalence, where they don't know if it's fine or they don't know if it's not fine. So he just remains suspended, and that's what he wants to stay. Actually, the hospital over here becomes this liminal space between the civilian space and the military space, right? So this is where people come in from the war and go back to the war as well, and sometimes if they are more unfortunate, they don't go back, to die from the war. But this seems to be a buffer between the civilian space and the military space, and Vercerin is very much inhabiting, and he very much wants to inhabit this buffer liminal space between the two zones, right? So, and Dunbar obviously makes it more complicated. He says, I am part of the dream, I'm in the dream where Vercerin is holding a fish in one of his hands. The colonel's face flushed with embarrassment. He glared at them both with cold, unforgiving resentment. Get up off the floor and into your bed, he directed Dunbar through thin lips. And I don't want to hear another word about this dream from either one of you. I've got a man on my stuff to listen to disgusting bilge like this. Right? So, again, anticlimax and bathos play a big part. So the colonel is very, very angry, listening to all this complications about dreams, and he asks both of them to just go away and dismisses them at the moment. And he says, I don't want to hear about it. I've got a man on my stuff. So I've actually hired someone to listen to disgusting bilge like this. So again, it seems to make a comic command. So there's a man hired to hear other people's dreams because the doctors don't have a clue, and the military officers obviously don't have a clue. So to hire someone who's obviously a non-specialist to listen to other people's dreams, and that seems to be a permanent position, that seems to be a permanent professional position over here. Just why do you think, carefully inquired Major Sanderson, the soft and thick-set, smiling stuffed psychiatrist to whom the colonel had ordered Vercerin sent, that Colonel Ferrej finds your dream disgusting, right? So, and then the other major, he just wants, and he's also a psychiatrist, and he wants to know why Colonel Ferrej finds the dream disgusting. So it just gets more and more amusing, and sense. But again, we don't quite know whether to take it seriously, because if this is actually a dream and these people are actually mad and mentally very, very unhealthy, then obviously they need medication and medical help, which they're not getting at the moment. But the other possibility is also there, that they are just feigning, just malingering madness. So Wasserine replied respectfully, "I suppose it's either some quality in the dream or some quality in Colonel Farage." That's very well put, applauded Major Sanderson, who was squeaking GI shoes and had charcoal black hair that stood up almost straight. "For some reason," he confided, "Colonel Farage has always reminded me of a seagull. He doesn't put much faith in psychiatry, you know." "You don't like seagulls, do you?" inquired Wasserine. "No, not very much," admitted Major Sanderson with a sharp, nervous laugh, and pulled at his pendulous second chin lovingly, as though it were a long goatee. "I think your dream is charming, and I hope it recurs frequently so that we can continue discussing it. Would you like a cigarette?" He smiled when Wasserine declined. "Just why do you think," he asked knowingly, "that you have such a strong aversion to accepting a cigarette from me?" "I put one out a second ago. It's still smoldering in your ashtray." Major Sanderson chuckled. "That's a very ingenious explanation, but I suppose we'll soon discover the true reason." He tied a sloppy double bow in his open shoelace and then transferred a lined yellow pad from his desk to his lap. "This fish you dream about, let's talk about that. It's always the same fish, isn't it?" So this just gets hyper-medicalized. So Major Sanderson wants to know, he wants to medicalize everything. So he wants to know why the Colonel Farage doesn't like the dream. He wants to know why Wasserine will not accept a cigarette from him. And everything is attributed to some kind of a psychological, psychological disorder, right? Psychological tick. And why don't you take a cigarette from me? And Wasserine's response is, again, very commonsensical and very commonplace. That he doesn't want a cigarette now because I just put one out a second ago. It is still smoldering in your ashtray. Right, so we've already stolen a cigarette from you and it's already there in your ashtray. It's still smoldering, so there's no mental, psychological, deep, profound, existential reason informing my declination of your cigarette. It's just that I just had one a second ago and it's still smoldering in your ashtray. That's a real, tangible, material, vulgar reason. And again, this constant proximity between vulgarity and profundity runs throughout the novel, which informs the tragicomic, carnivalesque, absurdist quality that the novel takes, attitudinally as well as philosophically. Okay, so this fish that you dream of, let's talk about that. It's always the same fish, isn't it? "I don't know," Wasserine replied. "I have trouble recognizing fish. What does a fish remind you of? Other fish. And what do the other fish remind you of? Other fish." Major Sanderson sat back disappointedly. "Do you like fish?" "Not especially." "Just why do you think you have such a morbid aversion to fish?" asked Major Sanderson triumphantly. "They're too bland," Wasserine answered, "and too bony." So the last bit, again, is important. This person, Major Sanderson, obviously is trying to psychologize Wasserine. He keeps asking questions about fish, and he's trying to metaphorize the fish into something. He thinks the fish reminds Wasserine of something else. So this is a Freudian take in a certain sense. He wants the fish to function as a symbol to Wasserine. But look at the way Wasserine comes back to the banal reality of fish, right? So he asks a deep psychological, which he thinks is a penetrating question, that, why do you resent fish so much? And he's hoping for some metaphorical existential answer. But Wasserine's response is just very, very reflective of the attitude in this novel. He says they're too bland and they're too full of bones. So I don't like them because they're too bony. It's difficult to eat those, and also because in terms of taste, they're very, very bland. So again, very material, mundane reasons, right? So again, the refusal to make this into some kind of profound activity is something which the novel recurrently shows us. Major Sanderson nodded understandingly with a smile that was agreeable and insincere. So again, look at the juxtaposition of words which are opposites in quality, and in the process, what happens to the production of paradox, which is a recursive quality in the novel, the production of paradoxes. So a smile was agreeable and insincere. That's a very interesting explanation, but we'll soon discover the true reason, I suppose. Do you like this particular fish, the one you're holding in your hand? I have no feeling about it either way. Do you dislike the fish? Do you have any hostile or aggressive emotions towards it? No, not at all. In fact, I rather like the fish. Then I do like the fish. oh no, I have no feelings towards it either way. But you just said you liked it, and now you say you have no feelings towards it either way. I've just caught you in a contradiction. Don't you see? Yes, sir. I suppose you have caught me in a contradiction. Major Sanderson proudly lettered contradiction in his pad with a thick black pencil. Just why do you think, he resumed when he had finished looking up, that he made those two statements expressing contradictory emotional responses to a fish? I suppose I have an ambivalent attitude towards it. Now, what we can see here is they're playing with logic, they're playing with emotions, it's just sophistry of the highest order. And in a certain sense, it pretends to be a deep psychological session. It pretends to be a deep psychoanalytic session where, the sufferer is confessing about his psychological problems to the psychologist. But then what we see actually happening over here is a very slapstick quality of comedy. They are two people bantering with each other with a fish, and Wasserine obviously knows exactly what he's saying, and he's just being a ludic play of logic. He's just offering a ludic play, a ludic quality of logic, where he's sort of half chopping logic, putting together half chopped logic, and just creating or constructing a pseudo-logical situation. And the pseudo-logicality in the novel is something, again, very interesting, because that corresponds to the absurdist world that a novel is trying to portray in a political sense as well, because this is a war which is absolutely absurd. It's killing thousands and hundreds of thousands of people for no ostensible reason. It's just human greed, and then people are getting killed because of some absurd greed logic operating at some high level of that. But for common people like Wasserine, for common soldiers like Wasserine, it doesn't really make any sense about who wins the war and who loses the war. And so there's this quality of indifference, the quality of ambivalence, where which is there throughout the novel. And ambivalence operates as confusion, as well as the accommodation of different valencies, the accommodation of both valences, ambivalence. So both valences are accommodated in a way which is again adding to the confusion, adding to the cognitive chaos in the novel. So Major Sanderson sprang up with joy when he heard the words ambivalent attitude. You do understand, he exclaimed, wringing his hands together ecstatically. Or you can't imagine how lonely it's been for me, talking day after day to patients who haven't the slightest knowledge of psychiatry, trying to cure people who have no real interest in me or my work. It's given me such a terrible feeling of inadequacy. A show of anxiety crossed his face. I can't seem to shake it. So again, there seems to be a reversal over here, some kind of a reverse therapy happening, where the Major Sanderson, who's supposed to be a psychiatrist, he expresses his alienation, he expresses neurosis over here. He says no one understands me because no one seems to know what the problem is. And for the first time, he's talking to someone, he seems to talk to someone who seems to have some knowledge about their own mental condition. And that, in a paradoxical sense, creates empathy in his mind, creates some kind of a self-importance in his mind, prior to which he had been feeling terribly inadequate. And this inadequacy, again, is part of the neurosis, part of the neurotic condition that he experiences, right? And he says, I can't seem to shake it, because everywhere I go, people are just neurotic, people are unable to understand me, people are unable to give me any access to their true conditions. And that is making me feel inadequate, that makes me feel, undervalued. And this undervalued inadequacy, combined with the sadness, obviously makes him melancholic in quality, in a very Freudian sense, the melancholia, which is a devaluation of the self, where you devalue yourself because there's no one to value you around you. And this seems to be the problem here with the Major Sanderson. Really, asks Wasserine, wondering what else to say. Why do you blame yourself for gaps in the education of others? It's silly, I know, Major Sanderson replied uneasily with a giddy, involuntary laugh. But it always depended very heavily on the good opinion of others. I reached puberty a bit later than all the other boys my age, you see, and that's given me a sort of, all sorts of problems. I just know I'm going to enjoy discussing them with you. So I'm eager to begin that I'm almost reluctant to digress now to your problem, but I'm afraid I must. So again, we don't quite know who is a patient over here and who is a counselor. So Wasserine seems to take the other stance. Wasserine seems to ask the questions over here. And Major Sanderson talks about his puberty, talks about his adolescence, talks about his lack of confidence. And this blurring of borderline between the patient and the therapist is again reflective of the blurring of borderlines to so many levels in a novel. We don't know who's the enemy and who's the friend. We don't know who is the invader and who is invaded. We don't know who is a civilian and who is the military. So we don't know who is rational and irrational. So all the notional borderlines, the notional binaries blur away over here. Okay, so okay, now this is a section where Westerain talks about Dunbar, and again malingering comes in the foreground, and how people sort of pretend to have certain conditions and in order to stay away from the war. So Major Sanderson smiled tauntingly and wrote Dunbar on his pad. "Why are you limping?" he asked sharply as Westerain moved to the door. "And what the devil is a bandage doing on your leg? Are you mad or something?" So again, Westerain's malingering, Dunbar's malingering, those get cited over here. "I was wounded in the leg, that's why I'm in the hospital for." "Oh no, you're not," gloated Major Sanderson maliciously. "You're in the hospital for a stone in your salivary gland, so you're not so smart after all, are you? You don't even know what you're in the hospital for." "I'm in the hospital for a wounded leg," Westerain insisted. Major Sanderson ignored his argument with a sarcastic laugh. "Well, give my regards to your friend Dunbar, and you will tell him to dream that dream for me, won't you?" So again, the quality of dream as some kind of a playful, superficial activity comes to the fore. But Dunbar had nausea and dizziness with his constant headache, and wasn't inclined to cooperate with Major Sanderson. Hungry Joe had nightmares because he had finished 60 missions and was waiting again to go home, but he was unwilling to share any when he came to the hospital to visit. Right? So we have versions of war, we have descriptions of war which are traumatic in quality. Someone finished 60 missions and wants to go home, but he doesn't want to share anything. So obviously there's a lot of neurosis, a lot of psychosis, a lot of trauma in the word, but it is not represented in a way which is consistent or consistently tragic. Right? So there's always this tragicomic quality about trauma which creeps in. "Hasn't anyone got any dreams for Major Anderson?" Westerain asks. "I hate to disappoint him. He feels so rejected already." So it's almost as the soldiers who are suffering need to offer some therapy to the therapist, because he's just feeling so rejected, feeling so excluded and alienated. So soldiers who are suffering from trauma must come together and provide some kind of a dream activity to the therapist, who doesn't feel very useful at this point of time. "I have been having a very peculiar dream ever since I learned you were wounded," confessed the chaplain. "I used to dream every night that my wife was dying or being murdered, or that my children were choking to death on morsels of nutritious food. Now I dream that I am out swimming in water over my head and a shark is eating my left leg in exactly the same place where you have your bandage." "That's a wonderful dream," Dunbar declared. "I bet Major Sanderson will love it." So this section, I think, and I'll stop at this point today, but this section sums up the attitude in the novel, sums up the emotion in the novel. So here we have a person, the chaplain, who gives a very graphic description of a really disturbing dream. So he just dreams about his wife and children being murdered. They were getting killed in very, very grotesque ways, and that has been described to us in very graphic details. The wife is being murdered and the children are being choked to death on morsels of nutritious food. So again, look at the description over here. So they've been choked to death, children, and that's like a terrible tragedy. You can't even think about it, you can't even imagine that. But the way it is represented is they're given morsels of nutritious food, and that is choking them to death. So again, we have a paradox over here. And now he says, "Now I dream that I'm out swimming in water over my head, and a shark is eating my left leg exactly the same place where you have your bandage." So Westerain's bandage is there in a certain spot in his leg, and he thinks that the shark is eating his head, and then the bandage is on a left leg. So again, there's no juxtaposition, there's no corollary, there's no connect. It's a complete disintegrated dream, which is quite grotesque in quality. Look at the response of Dunbar over here. "That's a wonderful dream," Dunbar declared, and I bet Major Anderson will love it. So again, that seems to be a delicious dream for the therapist, and it's exactly something we should convey to Major Anderson, because he will love it, he will dissect it, he will analyze it, and that will give him some kind of a sense of importance. So we must convey that back to the therapist, and this seems to be said with some kind of excitement and happiness. Now, excuse me, Sanderson replies, "There's a horrible dream," Major Sanderson cried. "It's filled with pain and mutilation and death. I'm sure you had it just to spite me, I'm not even sure you belong to the army with a disgusting dream like that." Westerain replied, "Thought he spied a ray of hope. Perhaps you're right, sir, he suggested slyly. Perhaps I ought to be grounded and return to the States. Right? So, so this again gives a sense of anticlimax over here. So this is conveyed to Major Sanderson, and he seems disgusted. He seems, shocked at his description of the dream, and he say, you don't belong to the army. It's a disgusting dream. You're just a perverse person. You ought to be dismissed. And that sense of, that sense of disgust that is given towards Wasserman, it just triggers this ray of hope in his mind. He says that just, spied a ray of hope. He says, perhaps you're right, sir. He suggested slightly, perhaps I ought to be grounded and return to the States, right? So, you ought to be dismissed. I ought to be sent off. I ought to be, sent back home. And again, we're looking at a very interesting blurring of borderline between dismissal and emancipation. So he's about to be dismissed. There's a possibility he might be dismissed because he just given a disgusting dream, and the captain is very, very irritated with that, and he wants him to go away. And that feeling of being dismissed from the army entirely, that brings hope in Wasserman's mind, because that will obviously save him or protect him from any peril of the war, any predicament that a war might create to his body, to his self, to his identity. So I stop at this point today, but what we see over here is it's a pre-PTSD universe, as in a pre-classification of PTSD universe, where these are people who may or may not have these dreams. These are people who obviously suffer mentally because they are able to produce these dreams and describe them at will. And the fact that they're able to tell these dreams or describe these dreams, which may or may not have happened, these are probably pseudo dreams, quasi dreams, but the way they can narrativize it in very graphic, grotesque manners goes to show the cognitive flatness that they have. And this is something which we have discussed already, a sense of cognitive flatness, a sense of being immune to tragedy, right? Because they are so numbed by the dailiness of tragedy that it's not tragic anymore. It just becomes a ritual, a routine for them, right? It's almost like a stimulation which has stopped stimulating them because it's such a normal thing, it's such a recursive thing, it has been normalized. So what we see over here is a normalization of tragedy, or normativization of tragedy. Tragedy becomes the norm over here, and in the process it's also flattening out of any tragic intensity, a flattening out of any tragic grandeur, a flattening out of any tragic depth. So the depthlessness of the novel is something which we need to be very, very, we pay attention to. It's a very superficial novel, a very depthless novel, and a superficiality and depthlessness are actually indicators of the mental health, the mental state of these people who have no depth left. They're so numb by tragedy, so numb by trauma, that they cannot experience it differently anymore. It just becomes part of the daily routine, like brushing the teeth. They can banter about it, they can joke about it, they can make grotesque gallow humor about it. But that's the way it is being internalized in their system. And the entire narrative, the very postmodernist tragicomic narrative, seems to reflect that recursively. So I stop at this point today. We'll begin to wind up the novel in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.